The idea of getting a tattoo for my daughter had been with me for months, haunting my thoughts like a lingering whisper I couldn't shake. She was 2 now, bright-eyed and curious, and I wanted something permanent to carry her with me, something close to my heart, quite literally. It wasn't the kind of decision I made lightly either. I wasn't one for tattoos before, but this felt right, like a small act of devotion, inked on the surface, reflecting what I already carried inside. That's how I found myself sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit tattoo parlor one rainy afternoon. As the needle buzzed and dug into my chest, the pain was sharp but manageable. It felt good in a strange way, like I was earning it, suffering in a way that matched the deep love and fear that came with being a parent. When it was done, I ran my hand over the ink, marveling at the way it looked etched against my skin. Her name, Luna, circled in a soft, flowing script around a tiny star, just over my heart. I smiled, imagining her tiny hands touching it one day, asking what it meant. My wife, Sarah, was surprised when I showed her that evening. So were a few friends we had over for dinner. I saw the look on her face, the genuine shock, mixed with a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Everyone smiled and clapped me on the back, saying how sweet it was. I beamed, proud that I had finally done it. For once, it felt like I had made the right choice without second-guessing myself. The next day at work, I unbuttoned my shirt during lunch to show my colleagues. There was a moment of silence, stunned expressions as they stared at the new ink. One guy even muttered that it was serious dedication. But later, as I wrapped up my tasks for the day, I caught the low murmur of a conversation behind me. 2 of my co-workers were speaking in hushed tones, just out of earshot, but the words floated toward me in pieces. "I feel sorry for him," one said. "Yeah, Luna might not even be his." At first, I froze, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. My mind clung to denial like a drowning man to driftwood. No, that couldn't be right. It had to be some stupid joke, a misunderstanding. But something about the way they whispered, it sounded too deliberate, too knowing. A sudden wave of nausea surged through me, and I found myself turning toward them with a sharp, involuntary glare. "What the hell did you just say?" I demanded, louder than I intended. They both looked startled, exchanging glances like they hadn't expected me to overhear. One of them shifted uncomfortably, but the other, the bolder one, finally spoke up, voice hesitant but steady. "It's just something we heard," he admitted. "When your wife used to work here, she, hooked up with the boss to get promoted." His words punched through me, leaving me breathless. My heart hammered in my chest, and my vision blurred as if someone had knocked the air from my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't think. They kept talking, their voices distant and hazy now, trying to justify what they had just said, as if softening the blow would somehow make it less devastating. But the damage was already done. My mind spiraled into chaos. How could this be true? Sarah? With him? And worse, was Luna even mine? I stormed out of the office without saying a word, the door slamming behind me, so hard the glass rattled. My thoughts raced faster than the engine as I sped home, breaking every traffic rule on the way. My hands gripped the wheel tighter with every kilometer, my mind drowning in shame, fury, and disbelief. Sarah didn't know I had heard anything. She had no idea what I was coming home with, a tidal wave of rage and suspicion that I could barely contain. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding out of control, and my chest felt like it might burst. I slammed the doors shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. Sarah was sitting on the couch with Luna in her lap, smiling at me, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and she didn't even know it yet. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the 2 of them, my wife, my daughter, the life we had built together. And in that split second, it felt like it was all crumbling beneath me. The moment I saw Sarah sitting there, cradling Luna with that innocent smile, something inside me snapped. My vision narrowed, my thoughts tangled in a storm of rage I couldn't hold back. The weight of betrayal, whether confirmed or not, consumed me entirely. It was like I had been poisoned, and the venom coursed through every vein, demanding release. "How could you?" The words tore from my throat before I even realized I was shouting. My voice cracked under the weight of anger, fear, and betrayal. Luna jumped in her mother's arms, startled by my sudden outburst, her tiny face scrunching in confusion. Sarah's smile faltered immediately, replaced by a look of alarm. "What's wrong?" she asked, standing up slowly, cradling Luna close to her chest as if shielding her from something. I couldn't hold back. "Don't play dumb with me," I shouted, taking a step forward, my fists clenched so tightly that my knuckles ached. I know about what happened. Everyone knows, Sarah. Everyone at the office has known this whole damn time. Just not me." She blinked, stunned, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was low, shaky, but I saw it, the flicker of fear. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She just didn't know how much I had found out. "Don't lie to me," I roared, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed the nearest object, a picture frame from the coffee table, and hurled it against the wall. Glass shattered, scattering across the floor. Luna started to cry, and Sarah held her tighter, her eyes now brimming with tears as well. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" I stepped closer, towering over her. "I heard everything. You slept with him. With my boss. Do you know what they said about me? Do you know how long they've been laughing behind my back?" Sarah's face went pale, her lips quivering as she tried to find words. Any words. But none came. She just stood there, frozen, clutching Luna like a lifeline, as if that could somehow shield her from what was coming. I didn't give her a chance to explain. I paced back and forth in the living room, breathing heavily, my body trembling with uncontrollable anger. "Do you know how sick I felt hearing it from someone else? Do you even care what you've done to me? To us?" Sarah shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "It's not true," she whispered hoarsely, but the words were so faint, so empty, I could hardly believe she even tried. "Don't you dare lie to me," I hissed, stepping closer. "Don't you dare." I wanted to grab her, to shake the truth out of her, to make her admit what she had done. But instead, my fists found the wall, and I slammed them into it with everything I had over and over, until the plaster cracked beneath my knuckles. The pain shot up my arms, but I didn't care. It was nothing compared to the storm inside me. "Tell me the truth," I yelled, turning back toward her, breathing heavily like a man drowning in rage. "Did you do it? Was it him? Did you cheat on me just to crawl your way up the ladder?" Sarah backed away, her face twisted in fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please stop. Luna is scared." "You're scaring her. I barely heard her. All I could see was red. You don't get to ask me to stop. Not after what you've done. Do you even know what this feels like? What you've turned me into?" My voice cracked under the weight of the betrayal. Luna was wailing now, her tiny sobs piercing through the tension, but I was beyond reason. All the memories, all the late nights where I told myself I was building something solid with Sarah, they meant nothing now. It was all a lie, and every second of it burned. "You ruined everything," I spat. "You ruined me?" Sarah sobbed quietly, clutching Luna as though she could somehow protect her from the chaos unfolding in the room. "It's not true," she whispered again, but even she sounded like she didn't believe it anymore. "You know what's even worse?" I said, my voice dropping low. "She might not even be mine, Sarah. Do you hear me? My own daughter. She might not be mine." Sarah gasped, as if the words physically struck her. "How could you say that?" she whispered, horrified, her tears flowing freely now. "Because I can't trust anything you say. I can't trust anything about you anymore," I shouted. The words came out more bitter, more raw than I expected. "I loved you. I built a life with you. And you." My voice faltered, but I forced the words out. "You threw it all away for what? For a goddamn promotion?" Sarah shook her head violently, clutching Luna tighter, rocking her back and forth as if that could erase what had just been said. No, it's not like that," she mumbled through her sobs. "It's not what you think. Please believe me." But I couldn't. I didn't know how to. Not anymore. I sat on the edge of the couch that night, cradling my head in my hands, my mind looping through every possible outcome. No sleep came, just waves of anger, doubt, and a gnawing sense of betrayal that wouldn't let go. Sarah stayed upstairs with Luna, the sound of her muffled sobs drifting through the house, but I refused to go to them. I couldn't. The thought that Luna might not be mine was a parasite in my mind, eating away at every fond memory I had of her. Every first word, every moment I spent rocking her to sleep when she cried, it all felt tainted like a cruel joke. I hated myself for even doubting her, hated that Sarah had put me in this position, but I couldn't let it go. I needed to know the truth. Without it, I would never be free. When the first light of dawn crept in through the windows, I made my decision. I wasn't going to live in the limbo of maybe. I needed answers, no matter how much they might hurt. I waited until I heard the sound of movement upstairs, Sarah shuffling around, likely exhausted from a sleepless night. Then I got up, grabbed my keys, and called out to her from the bottom of the stairs. "Get Luna ready," I said, my voice cold and final. "We're going to the clinic." Sarah's footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence between us. Then she called back weakly, "We don't need to do this. I swear, she's yours. Please don't make me." But I was already halfway out the door, starting the car, leaving her no room for argument. She could beg all she wanted, but I wouldn't spend another day choking on uncertainty. A few minutes later, Sarah came outside, holding Luna tightly against her chest. Her hands trembled as she buckled her into the car seat, and I could see fresh tears glistening in her eyes. She looked at me, silently pleading for me to reconsider, but I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles went white. The drive to the clinic was unbearably quiet, the air between us thick with tension. Luna babbled innocently from the back seat, her small voice the only sound cutting through the suffocating silence. I fought the urge to glance at her in the rearview mirror. If I let myself feel anything, I might not be able to go through with it. Sarah sat beside me, her face pale and drawn, twisting her hands nervously in her lap. I could feel her stealing glances at me, desperate to say something, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Words meant nothing now, not until I had proof. When we pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Sarah's breath hitched, and I saw her wipe her eyes before unbuckling Luna. Her hands shook as she carried our daughter, or what I believed to be our daughter, into the building. The receptionist greeted us with a practiced smile that felt out of place in the middle of our turmoil. I could barely get the words out as I told her why we were there. "A paternity test," I muttered, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "We need a paternity test." The woman nodded, her expression neutral, like this was just another routine appointment. I wished I could have found the same detachment. Every step through the clinic's sterile halls felt like another crack forming in the fragile shell of our family. We were led to a small, brightly lit room where a technician asked us to sit. He explained the procedure in a calm, professional tone, but his words barely registered in my mind. All I could think about was the swab in his gloved hand and the awful, irreversible truth it might reveal. The test was over in minutes. First, they took a sample from me, then from Sarah, and finally, a gentle swab from Luna's tiny mouth. She giggled softly, unaware of the significance of what was happening. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to stay cold and focused. I couldn't let emotion cloud my judgment. Not now. When it was done, the technician told us we'd receive the results in 7 days. 7 days. It might as well have been a lifetime. As we walked back to the car, Sarah broke the silence for the first time. "I don't understand how you can do this to her," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's your daughter. I know she is. Why can't you just believe me?" I stopped in my tracks, turning to face her with a stare so sharp it cut the air between us. "Because I believed you before," I said, my voice low and bitter. And look where that got me. Her face crumpled, but I turned away before the sight of her tears could chip away at my resolve. I climbed into the car and waited for her to strap Luna back into the seat, watching in the rearview mirror as her hands shook with every buckle she fastened. The drive home was even quieter than the ride there. Every second dragged on like an eternity, the tension between us thick and unbearable. Luna eventually fell asleep in the back, her tiny snores a soft, cruel reminder of everything that was at stake. When we got back to the house, I didn't say a word. I went straight to the couch, grabbed a blanket, and stretched out, determined to put as much distance between Sarah and me as possible. She hovered in the doorway for a moment, like she wanted to say something, but I didn't look at her. I didn't care what she had to say. For the next 7 days, the house felt like a war zone frozen in a ceasefire. We didn't speak unless it was absolutely necessary, and every interaction was laced with tension and resentment. I could see the guilt weighing heavily on Sarah, but she refused to admit anything beyond desperate denials. And I clung to my anger like a shield, the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Every night, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling and imagining what the test results would say. I told myself I was ready for any outcome, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. If Luna wasn't mine, if my worst fear was the 7 days dragged by like an endless nightmare, each moment dripping with dread and resentment. Every time I saw Luna toddling around the house, clutching her stuffed animals or reaching up for me, my heart twisted. I wanted so badly to hold her without doubt. But doubt was all I had. Sarah tried to act normal, though we both knew there was no salvaging the quiet, rotting mess between us. I avoided her at every turn, refusing to talk beyond the basics. Anything more would just lead to another argument. Every look she gave me was a silent plea, but I shut her out completely. The only thing that mattered now was the truth. When the call finally came, I answered on the first ring, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Your test results are ready," the voice on the other end said. "You can pick them up anytime." I barely muttered a thank you before hanging up. My hands trembled, but I clenched them into fists. It was time. This was it. The moment I had spent 7 agonizing days waiting for. The moment that would decide everything. Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, as if bracing for what was coming. I could see the fear in her eyes, stark and undeniable. "Don't do this," she whispered, her voice raw and hoarse. "Please don't." But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door without a word, her quiet sobs trailing behind me. At the clinic, they handed me the envelope without fanfare, just another routine transaction to them. For me, it felt like the weight of my entire life was sealed inside. I stared at it for what felt like hours before finally ripping it open, the paper tearing unevenly under my shaking hands. I scanned the page until I found the numbers. Probability of paternity, 0%. The world stopped. My heart, my breath, everything, just gone. I stared at the words, willing them to change, to mean something else, anything else. But they didn't. Luna wasn't mine. A black hole opened inside me, swallowing every emotion at once. Rage, heartbreak, betrayal, humiliation. I clenched the paper, so tightly it crumbled in my hands. The people in the clinic went on with their business, completely unaware of the man whose life had just been destroyed in their waiting room. I drove home in a trance, barely registering the road beneath me. My knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, my mind spinning wildly between pain and fury. I had loved Luna with everything I had. I had built my entire life around her and Sarah. And now it was all a lie. When I reached the house, I didn't stop to think. I stormed inside, slamming the doors so hard that the sound echoed through the empty walls. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the couch, waiting for me, her eyes rimmed with red. When she saw the look on my face, she knew. She didn't even have to ask. "It's not what you think," she started, but I cut her off with a wave of the crumpled paper. "Get out." My voice was low, shaking with rage. She stared at me, stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to say it. "No, please." She stood, moving toward me, her hands outstretched. "Let's talk. We can work this out. I made a mistake, but she's still she's not mine." I roared, slamming the paper against her chest. "You lied to me. You ruined everything, and now you expect me to just talk about it?" Sarah's face crumpled in despair, but I was beyond caring. "I want you out. Both of you. Pack your things and leave. I don't care where you go." Tears streamed down her face, and for a brief moment, I thought she might fall to her knees and beg. But she didn't. She nodded slowly, defeated, and without another word, she turned toward the stairs to pack. I paced the living room like a caged animal, my rage too big for the space. It wasn't enough. Throwing her out wasn't enough. Not after what she'd done. Not after the life she had stolen from me. I needed to do more. I needed to make the man who had helped destroy my family pay. I grabbed my keys again, the adrenaline rushing through me like wildfire. My vision narrowed into a tunnel of fury, and the next thing I knew, I was driving toward the office, toward him. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking with barely contained rage. I could already picture his smug face, the man who thought he could ruin my life and walk away without consequence. Not today. Not ever. I stormed into the building, ignoring the receptionist's startled greeting. My footsteps echoed through the hallways as I made my way to his office. I threw the door open with a force that rattled the walls. And there he was, sitting behind his desk, grinning like the arrogant bastard he was. He looked up, surprised, but his expression quickly shifted into something smug and condescending. "You need something, man?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. I didn't answer. I didn't think. I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The framed certificates and awards behind him crashed to the ground, glass shattering everywhere. "You ruined my life," I shouted, slamming him into the wall again, harder this time. "You think you can sleep with my wife, take everything from me, and get away with it?" He tried to fight back, his fists swinging wildly, but I was too far gone to feel anything. My fists landed blow after blow, fueled by every ounce of anger, every sleepless night, every humiliating whisper I had endured. He collapsed to the floor, blood streaming from his nose, gasping for breath. But I didn't stop. I kicked him, again and again, until the world around me blurred into nothing but rage and violence. It took 2 security guards to pull me off him, their hands locking around my arms as they dragged me out of the office, kicking and screaming. "This isn't over," I yelled as they shoved me toward the door. "You'll pay for this. Both of you will." They threw me out into the parking lot, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, my fists throbbing from the assault. But for the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. I had fought back. I had made him feel, even for a moment, what it was like to lose control, to have everything ripped away. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. I sat in my car outside the office for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the adrenaline still rushing through my veins. I could feel the bruises forming on my knuckles, and the metallic taste of rage lingered in my mouth. Beating him down hadn't been enough. Not even close. The wreckage of my life still weighed heavily on me. The betrayal, the lies, and the years stolen. None of it could be undone by fists. But then it hit me. If Sarah had shattered my life, and my boss had been a willing accomplice, why should his life remain untouched? Why should his wife, his family, continue on, safe and blissfully unaware of the damage he'd caused? If he had taken everything from me, it was only fair I return the favor. I needed her to know. She deserved the truth. And more than that, he deserved to feel what I was feeling. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, as if squeezing the rage into something sharper, something purposeful. I knew where they lived. I had been to his house before, back when I still thought the world made sense, when I believed I was just a hard-working employee and not the punchline to a cruel private joke. Without hesitation, I put the car in gear and drove. The house sat in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, tucked behind perfectly manicured hedges and a wrought iron gate. The kind of place that practically screamed stability and wealth. As I pulled up, the anger inside me burned hotter. A part of me wondered if his wife had any idea who she was married to, or if she, too, was just another pawn in his selfish game. I parked across the street and stared at the pristine, white facade of the house. It was late afternoon, the perfect hour for destruction. I stepped out of the car, smoothed my wrinkled shirt, and crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. When I reached the front door, I rang the bell, my heart pounding, but not with hesitation. It pounded with the promise of what I was about to unleash. A few moments later, the door opened, and there she was, his wife. She looked exactly as I remembered her. Polished, perfect, the kind of woman who oozed grace, as if life had always been in her favor. Her brows furrowed slightly as she looked me over, her lips parting in mild confusion. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. For a moment, I wondered if she had any idea what was coming, if she sensed the bomb about to drop at her feet. But I didn't care. She needed to know. "Can I come in?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It's about your husband." Her brow furrowed deeper. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No," I said bluntly. "But you should. I'm the husband of the woman he's been screwing for the last 2 years." Her expression froze, and in that moment, I saw the flicker of disbelief, the first fracture in the flawless mask she wore. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I think we should talk," I said, stepping forward before she could shut the door in my face. She backed away instinctively, her mind likely scrambling to make sense of what I had just told her. I followed her inside, shutting the door softly behind me, the quiet click of it closing punctuating the unraveling of her perfect life. We stood in the middle of the pristine living room, surrounded by sleek furniture and carefully curated decor. She crossed her arms, as if trying to shield herself from the truth I had brought with me. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly, her voice carefully controlled, as though saying it too loudly might make it more real. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied. "Your husband, my wife. 2 years of lies. 2 years of them sneaking behind our backs while we were too blind to see it." She shook her head, as if trying to erase the words from existence. "No," she whispered, though the cracks were already forming in her composure. "That can't be true. He wouldn't." "Believe me, I didn't think my wife would either," I said, cutting her off. "But here we are." Her face went pale as the reality sank in, and I could see the battle waging in her mind. She wanted to believe me, and yet desperately wished I was lying. But the truth has a way of sticking, no matter how hard you try to deny it. "Do you need proof?" I asked coldly, pulling my phone from my pocket. "Because I have texts, photos, dates. Do you want to see?" She stared at me, her lips trembling, as though speaking would shatter whatever was left of her world. Finally, she gave a small, broken nod. I opened the folder on my phone where I had saved everything. Every damning message, every smug picture. I handed the phone to her without a word, watching as her eyes scanned the screen. The color drained from her face with each swipe, her breathing growing shallower. She covered her mouth with one hand as the tears started to fall. "No, no," she whispered, over and over again, as if saying it would change what she saw. I let her stand there in silence, her perfect little world crashing down around her. Part of me felt a bitter satisfaction. Finally, someone else was feeling the same agony I had endured. But it was hollow, like a glass already shattered beyond repair. "I thought you should know," I said flatly. She turned to me, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. "That's up to you," I said, my voice cold. "But now you know the truth." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I glanced back at her. "You want my advice? Make him suffer. Make sure he feels every second of the betrayal. That's the only way this gets even." With that, I walked out of the house, leaving her standing there, clutching my phone as if it were a lifeline to the truth. The door shut softly behind me, the quiet click echoing through the still air. As I stepped back into my car, a strange calm settled over me. I had delivered the truth. I had made sure his lies wouldn't stay hidden. Now all that was left was to wait and see how his perfect life unraveled, just like mine. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours after leaving the boss's house. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a cold emptiness in its wake. The satisfaction I thought I'd feel was fleeting, like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Sure, I had torn open his perfect life, watched his wife crumble under the truth. But somehow, it didn't make the hole inside me any smaller. When I pulled into a quiet parking lot by the water, I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel with numb hands. I had done it I had ripped apart everything that tied me to Sarah, smashed the illusion of family, and even dragged that smug bastard down with me. But as the silence wrapped itself around me, I realized I was still alone, still carrying the weight of what I'd lost. Luna. The thought of her name hit me like a punch to the gut. For 2 years, she was my everything. She was the reason I kept going on sleepless nights and long days. And now, she wasn't mine, or at least, not in the way that mattered on paper. But the memories, her laugh, her first words, the way she looked at me with those bright, trusting eyes, those were real. They were mine, whether biology agreed with it or not. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the seat, and tried to breathe through the ache. I didn't know what to do with all the love I still felt for her. It was tangled now, woven with betrayal, anger, and loss. But even through the anger, one truth gnawed at me. None of this was her fault. By the time I got home, it was late, and the house was eerily quiet. Sarah's things were gone, just as I had ordered. Her closet, the dresser, the little pieces of her scattered around the house. All of it had vanished. The emptiness hit me harder than I expected. She had taken Luna too, leaving the house as lifeless as I felt inside. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the spot where Luna used to play, and for a moment, the silence felt unbearable. I hated Sarah for what she'd done, but I hated even more that Luna had been dragged into this mess. I had wanted answers, justice, revenge, but now that I had it, all I could think about was how much I missed the sound of Luna's tiny feet running down the hallway. It was then that the weight of everything came crashing down. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands, and let the grief consume me. For the first time in days, I didn't fight it. I didn't try to push it down or mask it with anger. I just let it wash over me in waves. Grief for the life I thought I had, grief for the daughter I believed was mine, grief for the family that had shattered beyond repair. A few days passed in a blur of silence. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't return to the office. There was nothing left for me there. The boss had already called several times, but I didn't answer. I imagined the chaos I had unleashed in his life, and while part of me felt satisfaction, it was a hollow victory. His wife would leave him. Eventually, his business would likely crumble under the weight of his lies. But in the end, I still had to live with the wreckage of my own life. It wasn't until the fourth day that Sarah called. Her name flashed on my phone, and for a long moment, I debated letting it ring. But something in me, a flicker of unfinished business, made me answer. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. Her voice was soft, cautious. "I need to pick up a few things for Luna." I left her favorite blanket behind. The mention of Luna twisted something deep inside me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "When?" "In an hour," she replied. "I don't want to fight. I just want to get what's hers and leave." I swallowed the knot in my throat. "Fine." When Sarah arrived, I opened the door without a word. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from days of crying. She avoided my gaze as she walked past me, heading toward the nursery. I stayed by the door, arms folded, keeping my distance. She came back a few minutes later, carrying Luna's stuffed rabbit and a small bag of clothes. But as she reached the door, she hesitated. "She keeps asking about you," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "She doesn't understand why you're not there." Her words hit me like a knife to the chest. I clenched my jaw, struggling to keep my composure. "She's not mine, Sarah. She never was." Sarah shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You were her dad. You still are, if you want to be." I stared at her, the anger simmering beneath the surface, ready to lash out. But beneath that anger was something more complicated, something closer to regret. I hated Sarah for what she had done, but Luna? She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't betrayed me. She had only ever loved me. For a moment, I thought about slamming the door in Sarah's face, cutting them out of my life for good. But as I stood there, all I could see was Luna's bright smile, the way she used to light up when I walked into the room. And I realized that some things, some connections, went deeper than DNA. "Tell her," I hesitated, swallowing hard. "Tell her I'll see her soon." Sarah's breath hitched, and she gave me a small, tearful nod. "Thank you." I didn't respond. I just closed the door behind her and leaned against it, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't the closure I thought I wanted. But it was a start, one small step toward figuring out what came next. The house was still empty, the silence still heavy. But for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like something I could live with, something I could rebuild from, because maybe, just maybe, some things aren't meant to be fixed. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to live. And so, I sat down on the couch, breathing in the quiet, and prepared myself for whatever came next.